Good afternoon, and welcome to the 18th lecture in the Rethinking Open Society series. It's a special pleasure to welcome a great scholar, a great sociologist, who also happens to be a friend. Michele Lamont is the Robert Goldman Professor of European Studies. She's the Professor of Sociology and of African American Studies. She's the Director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. She's one of the pillars of Harvard University, one of those people who exerts power and influence both in her discipline and in a great university, but does so in a kind of graceful and effortless exercise of authority that I very much admire. So there we go. She's the author of The Dignity of Working Men, a wonderful book that dates back to 2001. She's also the author, more recently, of Getting Respect, Responding to Stigmatization in the United States, Brazil, and Israel. Notice in her work, I think one of the things, I'm not a sociologist, in the olden days I used to be a historian, but one of the aspects of her work that is, I think, been enormously illuminating throughout has been her attempt to give sociological meaning and precision to things like dignity, feelings like stigmatization, the inner experience of oppression and suffering and exclusion. And that seems to me an extraordinarily important part of our thinking about open society. An open society isn't just a society that respects the equality of individuals, isn't just a society that's open to the external world. It's a society that cares deeply and retail, i.e. one by one, about the dignity of its members, about stigma, the stigmatic burdens of class, of gender, of race, of all forms of difference, getting a vision of openness in which we genuinely embrace a difference, refuse fear, and think hard about how the world looks to someone else. The constant struggle of empathy, of reaching out, of crossing boundaries, is a crucial part of the story of open society, and that's why it's particularly important to have Michele talk to us tonight. She comes, let me say, on the back of an absolutely extraordinary professional achievement, which we should celebrate, which is she's just been awarded the Erasmus Prize from the King of, is it the King of the Netherlands? Yeah, it's the King of the Netherlands. So she was right up there. She was in Paris Match. She was on the front page of everything, shaking hands with the King of the Netherlands. So a little respect, folks. I mean, this is... We're just delighted to have her here. Our procedure is that, as you know, she will give her lecture and then we'll sit down and hopefully have at least a half an hour, possibly 40 minutes of questions, and the event will conclude precisely at 7 o'clock. And because I always forget this afterwards, I should tell you that there are focaccia afterwards. Am I right? I look nervously at Kinga Powell, universal source of focaccia. She says, she confirms there are focaccia. So without further ado, Michele Lamont will speak to addressing the recognition gap, destigmatization, and the reduction of inequality. Michele Lamont.
Thank you so much. So I must say what a pleasure it is to be here, not only because I've long had a lot of admiration for this institution and for the work that George Soros has done all over Europe, but also because my dear co-ethnic co-national, I will call him my co-ethnic, is now in charge of he can't speak French with a Quebecois accent, which is the true mark of, before I start, I just want to say that I met Michael the first time we were together at the University of Warwick for a conference on post-national Europe, which was precisely on cosmopolitanism. So the themes that he just discussed in introducing me were precisely the themes that we talked about then, and that were at the center of my book, The Dignity of Working Man, which was about everyday cosmopolitanism, what brings people together. And I remember very well, before moving from Princeton to Harvard, I consulted him. I believe at that conference or shortly after, about whether I should go or not. So you see, I owe him a lot. So let me get start. I'm going to give you really a bird-eye view of much of my scholarship. I have a dear colleague from Harvard here, Suzanne Silverman. Hi, Suzanne. So it's really it's a version of the paper that I presented, the presidential address that I delivered this summer at the American Sociological Association. And you will see that I don't spend a lot of time locating my work in relation to other people's work. And it's very, very high level, but it's not that abstract for those of you who are not sociologists. And you will see that in a context where your country has been debating refugees, has been debating populism and boundaries of all sorts, how much this is very much the object of my presentation. So over the last decades, we've seen a growing number of groups that have been making various kinds of membership claims. So we can think in the American context of Occupy, Black Lives Matter, many LGBTQ movements. We've had a lot of denunciation of microaggression on American campuses. There was a big media to do about, issues of misappropriation of Korean food on Oberlin campus, which was the object of ridicule. In Canada, you've had the I Do No More movement. You've had, of course, Muslims wanting to live their fate in public all over Europe, but also, very importantly, in the context of the American election, you've had these white working class men who feel like they've been downwardly mobile and have felt in some ways vindicated by Trump. So at the same time, there's been an enormous increase in inequality, and since the publication of Piketty's Capital, I think the level of collective awareness in the United States and Europe about the fact that we now have the highest level of inequality since 1929 has increased a lot. But my talk is really here today about the fact that what Piketty writes about, issues of redistribution, is only half of the equation. To really understand inequality, we need to think about distribution and recognition at the same time. And my goal is to think about inequality as a deeply multidimensional phenomenon. So I will be providing tools to think about this. And many sociologists have been working on elements of this, but I'm trying to develop an agenda that would be empirically based and systematically attacking these questions. So where should we turn for guidance? We've had the work of philosophers Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser, who have written about and discussed injustice as being based on politics of recognition and distribution. So they point us toward this need for a systematic analysis of recognition and distribution as interacting dimensions of inequality. At the same time, what I'm trying to do here is talk about the recognition gap, and I will define this in a second. Sociologists have a very large literature on the question of the achievement gap, which concerns the goal is to reduce observable consistent patterns of disparity in educational measures. So we now need to attack the recognition gap, which is the issue of the disparity in cultural membership between groups. So I will address how can we do this. But before I start, I want to address the question of why does it matter? Many people will probably think, if you're hungry and homeless, who cares if you suffer from stigmatization? if you lack recognition? Is it only a question of having people feel good about themselves? Well, I would argue that recognition matters a lot. A few examples. The poor in the United States, they're probably more stigmatized than they are in any other advanced industrial societies. They know that they experience very little compassion on a daily basis, little solidarity. They know that the government gives them very little, in part because the population does not support redistributions. They really feel alone and out of luck, and this does not have to do only with poverty, it also has to do with the lack of recognition. There's a number of literatures that show that recognition has an impact on quality of life on many dimensions. So for instance, on health disparity, there's a large literature that shows that perceived racism translates into chronic stress, allostatic load, what epidemiologists call the wear and tear of everyday life. It matters in access to resources. Think about teenagers who are kicked out of their parents because they are LGBTQ. This is a case where stigmatization leads to poverty. Think about the case of blue-collar workers who can think of themselves as losers. They don't have to think of themselves as losers. And in one of my books, I showed that they think of themselves as losers more in the United States than in France. So this is also the result of social conditions, but it also matters for politics. So one of the papers I wrote is on Donald Trump and how he went about appealing to the white working class. And he did that by doing something very simple, which is to remove blame, to point to globalization and to claim that he would give them jobs. But at the same time, he pointed to scapegoated immigrants and the Muslims and refugees, and we know this because we did a very detailed NV using the computer-assisted software NVivo. We analyzed 73 of his presidential speech, and we were able to identify which groups he talked about positively and negatively and most often. So we can see very clearly here what are the patterns, and I believe that we cannot understand the outcome of the last presidential election in the US without factoring this recognition gap. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So the broad objective of the talk is to develop this empirical sociology of recognition and stigmatization. And in order to do this, we need concepts, measures, description of gaps. Is there a recognition gap? The analysis of pathways through which destigmatization may operate. And we need a research agenda. So this is what I'm going to do. So this is the outline. First, I'm going to talk about the ways in which neoliberalism feeds this recognition gap by creating stronger boundaries toward any group that suffers from a lack of self-reliance. Then I'm going to talk about collective well-being and the ways in which extending recognition to the largest number is crucial as a measure of the quality of societies. Third, I'm going to talk briefly about this book, Getting Respect, that Michael mentioned, which is about how African Americans, Black Brazilians, and three groups in Israel experience and respond to stigmatization and discrimination. And finally, I'll talk briefly about another project where we compare three groups that have experienced very different degrees of destigmatization over the last decades. People with HIV/AIDS, which is the success case, a group that has destigmatized extremely rapidly. The obese, who are not destigmatizing in any way, and this is the American context, and African Americans, that is in between case. And I think looking at cases of successful and less successful destigmatization is a good way to understand how we should move forward. And I'll conclude with a kind of what is to be done section for social scientists, policymakers, and citizens. So how to extend this cultural membership to the largest number? I'm really going to talk a lot about the role of institutions and cultural repertoires as resources that can be activated for this purpose. And how people respond is shaped by the context in which they live, particularly by their degree of groupness and the cultural repertoires that they have at their disposal. In the role, in discussing destigmatization, I'll talk about the crucial role of knowledge workers, people like ourselves, but also medical, legal, policy experts who have fed the work of social movements. So that is the answer. A few concepts. First, I anchored the talk in this concept of recognition, which you will recognize as being borrowed from Axel Honneth. And Honneth defines recognition as a social act by which the positive social worth of an individual or group is affirmed or acknowledged by others. He focuses on acts, I focus on cultural processes. So if you want to know more of my thinking about this, I published in 2014 a paper titled What is Missing? Cultural Processes and the Making of Inequality, which looks at a number of processes that include stigmatization, racialization, and others. This is not something I can talk about in detail here. Stigmatization is borrowed from Goldman, and it is the process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences, and concomitantly, the concept of destigmatization points to the social processes by which low-status individuals can gain recognition and cultural membership. And the anchor concept is that of cultural membership, which is the status characteristics of those who are collectively defined as valued members of the community. So through the talk, I'm also going to be referring to this concept of cultural repertoires, which is very crucial in my field of cultural sociology, and which refers to the scripts, the institutionalized scripts or narratives that are readily available as people try to make sense of their world. And for instance, in my earlier work, I argued that if the French workers draw much stronger boundaries toward the poor and much weaker boundaries toward the poor and blacks than do their American counterpart, it's not because they are inherently racist, it's because they are cultural repertoires that have been diffused in the French context over centuries, such as republicanism, socialism, and Catholicism that has fed very different kinds of material to the population for making sense of the world. So the goal is really to move away from national character explanation or essentialist views of the poor or of racial group. We cannot say class, black culture, for instance. We really need to think about what are the scripts that are fed to the population so that they can define very different understanding of their lives. Now, turning to neoliberalism here, I'm drawing on a book for the last 15 years. I've been co-directing with the political scientist Peter Hall, a research group called Successful Societies that has been funded by our Successful Society Canada, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And for 15 years, we've met 3 times a year to develop various projects. So the group includes people like Will Kimlicka, a number of people who had never talked about, we started with the issue of how do institutions and culture affect health. So really the question of what are the measures by which we can capture the quality of societies. And we produced, the second book came out in 2013, and it was titled Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era. And the first chapter, which I think is excellent, was written by Peter Evans, the sociologist of development, and Bill Sewell, the French historians, and they define neoliberalism as a syncretic process that closes and opens opportunities in different contexts, and which operates at the level of the market fundamentalism, the state that removes the barriers to markets, the audit society that Michael Powell and others have written about, and finally the scripts. And that is more unusual because most people don't think about this. The scripts of personhood, of what defines a worthy person, that came to be institutionalized with neoliberalism. And these scripts have to do with what is a valued person. It's someone who makes money, who's successful, who is competitive, who is self-reliant. So Ulrich Beck has written about the privatization of self as a crucial dimension of these changes. And we argue in this book, and I argue today, that one of the things that came with neoliberalism is a transformation of group boundaries resulting from this definition of a worthy person that has come to be deeply institutionalized. So in both countries we have, I'm going to talk a little bit about this book that came out in 2000 based on interviews conducted in '93. And this book focuses on low-status white-collar workers and blue-collar workers in Paris and New York I interviewed large numbers of people, African American and white in Paris and in New York rather, and North African and white in Paris. And the argument is that in both cases we have a working class that is economically downwardly mobile, experiencing de-skilling, a decline in prestige of national identity, and they also experience a change of status due to the decline of their gendered role as protectors and defenders of women. And that comes with a lot of resentment. The book argues that these groups define themselves as the people who should keep the world in moral order. And at the same time, as they told me in my in-depth interviews, we're the kind of people who pay our bills, even if we live in very difficult conditions. We make sure that our kids stay out of trouble. We are responsible, unlike these people who. And these people tend to be those who lack self-reliance, who sponge off the system. And unlike these black people on welfare. So this is what happens in the American context. I did very detailed content analysis of the interviews and show how these boundaries toward blacks and the poor were extremely strong in the American context, but much less so in the French context, with also different patterns of boundaries toward immigrants. So with much weaker, in the American context, when I did these interviews in '93, immigrants were rarely salient. And I did these interviews in and around the New York suburbs, where there was a large number of Latinos. In France, in contrast, the same kind of boundaries that were repeatedly drawn toward the poor and blacks tended to be drawn toward North African immigrants, where many people argue they are incompatible with French values, and they are incompatible not only because Islam is not compatible with the notion of human rights, but also because essentially they come here and they sponge off the system, and they're claiming more resources than they deserve, given that they were not born here. So already then in '93, these boundaries toward Muslims were extremely strong in the French context. Then recently I did the paper that kind of updated this analysis to see how they have been affected by neoliberalism. And with Nicolas Duvaux, a French sociologist, we covered all the recent literature on social change in France and found some very important changes. So for instance, whereas the youth was not salient in the boundary work that we documented, that I documented from these interviews in '93, they were extremely salient by 2000, in part because, well, youth suffer from 20% unemployment rate in the last few years. And of course, Romas also were very present, and they were not present earlier. And the other patterns are that whereas the French in '93 tended to be very accepting of the poor, in the sense that they said, yes, the market is cruel, you will always have a reserve army of workers. Duvaux wrote this book, L'autonomie des assistés, the autonomy of the unemployed, which was precisely about the fact that the poor now in France are being asked to demonstrate self-determination and self-reliance, whereas these scripts were far less salient 25 years ago. So we've really seen through this paper the ways in which the privatization of risk has transformed the kind of boundaries that characterize French society. And we've seen similar changes in the US with a decline in solidarity toward the poor. Survey data shows that poverty is more explained by moral failure today than by structural change, as compared to what we knew 20 years ago. And even African Americans who've been historically far more supportive of the poor, we've seen a decline in their feeling of solidarity toward the poor. So by some account also, boundaries toward blacks have rigidified in the US to the extent that yes, we had a decline in blatant racism, but subtle racism remains quite strong, and institutional segregation and spatial segregation has strengthened over the last few years. And at the same time, boundaries toward immigrants have rigidified a lot. So there's more analysis about Europe that I will not talk about, but the general point is that neoliberalism is having an impact on the definition of cultural membership across societies, with more emphasis on self-reliance, competitiveness, and socioeconomic success in how people define what is a worthy person. And this translates into a narrowing of cultural membership and a growing recognition gap. Now let's talk about how this helps us think about collective well-being. So I mentioned this book of the Successful Society team. The first book we wrote was titled Successful Societies, How Institutions and Culture Affect Health. And for that book we did a review of the various measures of the quality of societies that are used in the social science literature. Each literature has its own measures. So epidemiologists talk about the least, many of us view as the least ethnocentric measures one can think of: low infant mortality, high life expectancy. These are measures that even the Chinese would agree on, whereas if you take human rights, they may not agree. We have the economic measures that the political scientists prefer, that economists prefer rather, and the measures that political science prefer. One of the distinctive features of our project is that we focused on recognition as a dimension of collective well-being, and this is where we draw on the work of Kim Licca, who together with Keith Banting has developed something that is called the Multiculturalism Index, by which they tap the whole range of policies that societies adopt to favor the integration of immigrants, and such as, for instance, offering language courses for free, or various policies that facilitate their integration. Another member of our group, Irene Bloomrad, wrote a paper with Richard Wright, which came out, I think, in Perspective in Politics, which shows, it's a very Canadian paper, that the higher countries' rate on this multicultural index, the more emotionally and cognitively engaged with the host society immigrants are, and the more likely they are to run for political office. So it really suggests, and this is an important point, that these institutions, these policies, send implicit cultural messages to immigrants. We want you, which really translates into behaviors which are oriented, therefore, toward their greater integration. Another example, which I'm going to come back to later, is same-sex marriage in the United States. The 32 states that passed same-sex marriage over the last few years saw a decline in the number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in high school by 7%, and it was 28%, enormously high. So this is an example where, given that these policies have been so broadly discussed, it had a real impact on a shared definition of who belongs. And of course, these policies were not adopted to tell gay people you belong. It was a matter of justice, and they were passed because they felt they were discriminated in terms of inheritance law and various other ability to intervene on the behalf of their partner in case of health crisis. But this recognition gap, we also talk about it in terms of the cultural repertoires, which have considerable impact on group boundaries, and discourse of solidarity toward the poor, blacks, and immigrants. And this has to do with the criteria that become institutionalized about who is worthy. So one of the arguments that is central to this project is really to think about how to institutionalize societies where the majority of the population is not condemned to think of themselves as losers. So in a society where socioeconomic success becomes the criteria of membership, whether it is based on meritocracy or consumption, the majority of the population is condemned to think of themselves as losers, as we see in the United States, with a very high degree of, depression, mental health, opioid epidemics, etc., in this lower half of the population that cannot experience any upward mobility. So therefore, we need to figure out how to institutionalize, how to engineer, how to promote a plurality of criteria of evaluation, to change the scripts to which people understand their value. So in some ways, the project here is very much inspired by Herbert Marcuse's one-dimensional man. It's about, how can we move toward a society where businessmen, creative people, craft people, spiritual leaders can all be viewed as essential contributors to society, and not one where someone like Donald Trump can become widely perceived as a hero that is appealing to so many because he represents this, he best represents economic success as a form of excellence among human beings. So the point of this general section is that culture and institutions matter a lot in how we think about how to broaden cultural membership. So this is the second book. So now I'm going to turn to this book, Getting Respect, which is a project that I co-authored with 6 other people. It is a book that is literally co-written by 6 people. And it is organized around an American chapter, a Brazil chapter, and an Israeli chapter with members, experts of each of these countries contributing. And in this book, we do in-depth interviews with over 400 people living in and around Tel Aviv, New York City, and Rio de Janeiro. And the questions, these in-depth interviews, are about, we ask them, have you ever been treated unfairly? Describe to me what happened to you. Where was the incident? How did you respond? And for the US, for instance, we have 700 such incidents, which we analyze to really understand inductively what did they experience and how did they respond. So the project is influenced also by Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And we identify quite different patterns across places. We also had sets of normative questions. What do you teach your kids about how to respond to unfair treatment? And what are the best tools that your group has at its disposal to respond to in the US racism? So I'll give you an example of the kind of narratives that we collected. So this is an example of an African American man who finds himself with several white men in an elevator. And one of them, he describes to us the situation as follows. He says, one of them made a joke about blacks and monkeys. I said, man, I ain't into jokes. His demeanor changed, my demeanor changed. All the positive energy that was in there was being sucked out because of the racial part. I told myself, get out of here, because if I stay in here, I'm going to be in that circle and I won't be able to get out. The stress level rose. My tolerance was getting thin, my blood pressure peaking, and my temper rising. By the grace of God, thank you, Jesus, as I stepped off the elevator, there was a black minister walking past, and I said to him, can I speak to you for a minute, because I just encountered something that I got to talk about because I'm this far from exploding. I'd been in the job for only a week. This is all I need to get me fired. Now I'm trying to get through the affair to decide if I should go to the city to complain. So here you have an example where he describes to you what happened, but he also tells you about his thinking. How is he going to react? So we have such response, and we compared them across our 3 sites. And we looked at the main victims of racism in each of the 3 countries, African Americans, Black Brazilians, and we started with Arab Palestinians in Israel, who are not marked on the basis of their phenotype, but nationality. But we decided to add Ethiopian Jews in order to have black people in 3 different national contexts, and also Mizrahim, because Mizrahim are Oriental Jews whose family immigrated from Yemen or Iraq, and they perceive themselves as highly integrated. But when you look at the labor market data, they are concentrated at the bottom of the labor market, just like Black Brazilians are. But they also are Jewish, and they don't experience themselves as deeply stigmatized. And you will see in a few minutes how this influences the story. So people who are marked differently, and I'm not going to talk about Ethiopian Jews and Mizrahim because I don't have much time, but I can discuss them later. And we chose these cases because in Brazil you have very high level of intermarriage and low residential segregation. In Israel you have, security points, you have the civil war, you have conditions which suggest very hard boundaries between groups, and we thought, let's explore where African Americans fall in between. So our result, well, first, as we do these interviews, the main thing they're talking about, all these people, is not discrimination. The majority of the literature on racism in the US is discrimination. Things that can be demonstrated empirically through, for instance, audit, studies. If I go to ask for a job and you send an African American with exactly the same CV, I will be favored because I'm white. And this literature on discrimination is generally about having access to jobs, health, education, etc. Things that you can sue about. Most of what they talk about, our respondents, is being ignored, overlooked, underestimated. So it's really about stigmatization. It's an assault on the self. So we develop this notion of assault on the self and make the argument that the literature on stigmatization really needs to connect with the literature on discrimination so that we can understand both as dimensions of racism. And we find quite different patterns across the context. So Black Brazilians are twice more likely than African Americans to say that they're stereotyped as poor. And Arab Palestinians experience themselves as defined as the enemy within, and they suffer a lot of blatant racial insult and violence. So here I'm really describing to you our result at the most general level possible. It's a very, very long book, so you'll have to read the book to really know everything we find. When it comes to confrontation, very different patterns as well. Again, exit, voice, and loyalty led us to examine what was emerging. Well, in the US, 80%, the predominant response by a long shot is you got to confront. You have no choice. You have to confront. And 4 out of 5 of our American respondents say you have to confront, compared to only half of the Brazilians and still fewer of Arab Palestinians. So it's really the case that context enable and constrain different kinds of experiences. And we want to make sense of that. So Megan, an African American teacher, describes to us how she deals with white women who cut her when she's at the Pathmark, a grocery store. And she says they always do this, they always cut you off, and I'm really fed up with this. And I told one of the women, you do this not because I'm black, but because you're white, because my being black has nothing to do with you. And she reflects, of course, that comes to a shock to them, because they really don't want you to confront. If you confront them, they don't give you a word back. They pretend you don't exist, because in fact you're not there. I don't think she's going to do that to too many black women, black women again. One woman actually put off my foot to trip her. So there's really a sense that she's entitled, and it makes sense for her to interpret this as a case of racism, which is not at all the case in Brazil, as we will see in a few minutes. And then the second category is what we came to call management of the self. And this is all the thinking and brewing. Like, I don't want to be viewed as the angry black bitch again today. I want my colleagues to perceive me as a successful lawyer. Therefore, instead of exploding, I'm going to go away, I'm going to talk about it with my husband at night, I'm really going to think things through, and then I'm going to try to approach it very calmly and rationally. And this really contributes to the wear and tear that feeds into the huge racial disparity in health in the United States, because it is something that African Americans have to do nonstop. When we started the project, we thought the neoliberal responses, competition and work, would be the most frequent response, and it was not the case at all when we asked them to describe incidents. But when we asked them to describe what do they tell their kids, and what are the best tools that their group has at its disposal to respond, that is the response that was most frequent. You got to study, you got to be upwardly mobile, get yours, get what is yours, i.e. get your bit of the American dream. By consuming, by becoming middle class, you demonstrate that you're equal. So that we interpret very much as a confirmation of the power of neoliberalism in shaping how people understand how they establish equality. Okay? And when I did the Dignity of Working Man, one of the answers I found when I asked African Americans and North African immigrants what makes people equal, in the US people would say money makes people equal. If I can buy a house and you can buy a house, we're equal. Whereas of course it's a response that you never found in France. And I'm a former Marxist, so I never anticipated that people would say money makes people equal. Finally, in Brazil, the response we find are very different. We have to focus, equally people are talking about using confrontation, management of the self, and what we came to call no response, which is simply, I was so surprised I didn't say anything, or I was at the restaurant, I wanted to eat, therefore I decided not to confront. So in these cases, you don't have this extensive mulling things around that is factored into how to decide. To respond. And Arab Palestinians most often ignore because they have very little hope to change anything. In the Brazilian case, if they confront and don't respond as equally, it's because they have a lot of uncertainty about whether or not there's racism, which I will demonstrate in a second. So a lot of what our group, this is a book that took 9 years, so we spent a lot of time thinking together about first, you have to do the interviews, then you have to analyze the code and analyze the data, and finally come up with the framework that works for the cases, our 5 cases, our 3 countries. So we came up with an explanatory system that looks like this, which emphasizes socioeconomic background, what we came to call groupness, as well as cultural repertoires, which are these cultural resources that I already mentioned a few times. So the background factors are things you would expect, the law. All countries have affirmative action law, but the US has much more powerful legal tools to institutionalize and regulate these laws. How unequal the society is. Brazil is far more unequal than Israel or the United States. How much are the minority groups concentrated among the poor, etc. And all this feeds into what enables and constrains different responses across cases. And that became our question. Why these patterns that we find across our 5 groups, and what enables and constrains very different types of patterns. So we really drew on a mode of explanation that is very neo-Weberian, Verstian. It's a complex story that is very multidimensional. Then we look at the cultural repertoire. Zionism, my collaborators argue that both Mizrahim and Ethiopian Jews experience participatory destigmatization, which is to say, yes, we're stigmatized, but we're Jewish, so we belong in Israel. That repertoire is, of course, absent in the US. You have other national repertoires that are operative, racial democracy in Brazil, and the American dream in the US. But you have transnational repertoires having to do with neoliberalism or human rights that operate everywhere, and widely institutional scripts about the groups. So in the US, a notion that white people are domineering. So, that's a widely spread script about what whites are about. And finally, we talk about groupness, which is not only what psychologists talk about, in-group, out-group, the kind of Tashfeld and Turner social identity theory, but also the extent to which groups interact with each other, how much spatial segregation, institutional segregation, intermarriage, and the symbolic boundaries are these institutionalized scripts about what the groups are. It's not only happening at the intracranial level. So we can think, and we argue in the book that our 5 groups experience very different levels of groupness, with African Americans and Arab Palestinians being very strongly bounded. When you interview them, first thing they tell you is, I belong to this group, whereas our other 3 groups are weakly bounded, but slightly differently. And the relationship between types of response and boundedness is not linear. I mean, Arab Palestinians confront least, African Americans confront most. So clearly we have to think about a combination of factors to understand what's happening. So I'll give you an example of what's happening with the weakly bounded group so you can understand how it affects responses. So we have the example of a woman, a black Brazilian woman who comes back to her hotel at night after a long day of work, and she asks the clerk for her key because she wants to go to her room. Instead of giving her her key, he takes the phone, dials the room, no one answers, he hangs up the phone, he winks at her, and he says he's not there. And clearly he thinks she's a prostitute. But she feels so hurt that she feels she cannot confront him because he did not say anything explicitly about race. And she feels like, if I say anything, he'll think I'm paranoid. And my collaborators argue that in the Brazil context, there's this notion of racial coexistence that says, you're not supposed to be in each other's face about race, in part because we all have a black grandmother somewhere. We're all a little bit black. So therefore, this polarization between black and white is kind of perceived as uncivilized to jump on people. So, she tells us, I could not confront him because he did not say anything that I could point to show that he was being a racist. I went to my room, I called my husband, who's white, explained to him what happened, and he told me to calm down, and I was exaggerating. So what we do then is we look at the factors that explains this response, which have to do with the high degree of racial mixture in Brazil, which works against the polarization between groups, particularly racial polarization, and the fact that Black Brazilian identity is constituted around shared skin color, not shared culture or shared history. So all this means that not having immediate access to scripts or tools about Blackness leads her to respond very differently than does Megan, who presumes right away that this has to do with race. So those ready-made scripts have a huge difference, make a big difference in how people respond. Now, thinking about the Arab interviews, in their case, in a quarter of the incident mentioned, they say that they remain silent or they ignore. They express emotional detachment in a situation that many view as hopeless. So this is a form of resignation and a way to protect self-worth and to preserve them, to put themselves above the aggressor. So as a postal worker state, the best way to stick it to someone is to actually ignore them. So self-isolation in this case makes a lot of sense. In a context where residential segregation and confrontation are unlikely to make result, to produce results. So unlike the Brazilian, they have little doubt about whether an incident occurs or not. They know an incident occurred, but alternative explanations are limited by the high level of groupness they experience, bolstered by widely available institutionalized repertoires of group disadvantage, intergroup conflict, and exclusion. But it doesn't have to be that way. So to conclude, this book is really about the factors that enable and constrain different kinds of experiences and response. And we try to connect micro-level responses with meso-level responses, such as groupness and repertoires, the tools that people have access to make sense of their life. So therefore, we construct a causal chain that helps us understand what responses and how individuals are responding to stigmatization. Now I know that Michael wants us to have a dialogue, so I'll zip through the last section. I'm just going to highlight a few things. So the paper, which came out last fall in Social Science and Medicine, compares those three groups. And what we do is, in each case, we look at the various, we use the literature. So Abigail Sagi has a wonderful book on the obesity movement called What's Wrong with Fat? And she reconstructs the movement of people who oppose the stigmatization of obesity. So we use her work, we use a book by Steve Epstein on the destigmatization of HIV/AIDS people, and it's a comparative case study where we try to reconstruct the causal chain by which groups can be destigmatized. And we find very different degree of involvement of knowledge experts, which are listed in the rows, and also we look at which social movements they collaborate, and we see this is basically how it works. They draw, just as we just saw with Getting Respect, on a number of cultural resources that are available to them in the environment, and different social actors get mobilized to do things. The column called Action, this is what the current literature on stigma focuses on, the work of Lincoln Phelan or Bernice Pesco-Salido. In order to destigmatize, you need to remove blame. You need to show that people with HIV/AIDS, they're not all gay people or promiscuous. You say you can get AIDS even if you're not morally faulty. So by removing blame, then you can also engage in the institutionalization of rights. And there's some processes of institutional diffusion that go beyond the case of HIV/AIDS. So then you have the outcome. So this paper is very much also about a dialogue with the implicit association test that is being adopted by the Chicago police, by Harvard University, most of the major corporations in the United States are now, institutionalizing these implicit association tests as a tool to make people aware that even good moral people can be racist without knowing it. And the way it works is it's inspired by the nudging enterprise. the work of Richard Taylor, for instance, and it measures the speed at which you respond to messages as, you know, associating blacks and bad and white and good, or, you know, the speed at which you push a button when you are shown an image of Ronald Reagan versus Obama. And the goal is to show to everyone that we have, even if we think we're not racist, everyone is racist somewhere. And this, the people who are authors of this test show that if you take the test, you're less racist for 2-3 weeks, because you become self-aware. And then the response of organization is for people to repeat these tests all the time. Well, I don't think that's a solution. So we came up with this paper that is listed here, just came out actually in Nature Human Behavior under a new title Bridging Cultural Sociology and Cognitive Science, with the, you know, basically, it's a critique of these implicit association tests. And I think the solution in terms of social change is clearly to transform the scripts associated with groups, not to have people take these tests every 2 weeks. So the takeaway from this project is that as we contemplate all these movements against the background of the changes of the last 30 years, with, you know, Obama being elected, Khan, the first Muslim mayor of London. There's half a dozen books in sociology that shows how diversity has become institutionalized in higher education, in corporation, etc. These are, you know, important changes since World War II. We know incorporation of women, people of color, but you have at the same time a movement, this recognition claims that are multiplying. So, so what can we do? What is to be done? We have a recommendation, and I will simply mention a few of them since I'm running out of time. For sociologists, I think we need to embrace our role as producers of cultural scripts through which people lead their lives. One of the problems with the nudging industry is it has pushed people toward focusing on the intracranial. When I take my shower, all I hear on the National Public Radio is about nudging, and I think that has had disastrous effect, including in the context of the last election. So C. Wright Mills told sociologists our mission is to explain to people how individual problems are social problems. Well, I think we need to re-embrace this in the current context, and we need to do this not only by becoming the organic intellectuals of the progressive forces, as Michael Bourvoy urged to do a few years ago, but much more very explicitly by thinking people are making sense of their lives through cultural repertoires. And we need to push away from having institutionalized scripts that defines the worth of people simply through economic success. And we need to denounce in some ways the American dream, not because we want the poor to continue to wash toilets, but because an American dream that defines success in terms of what the top 25% can achieve condemns the majority to being losers. And we've seen this very much in the context of the meritocracy obsession of the last 20 years, which, you know, creates a lot of helicopter moms and a lot of suicidal teenagers, where the mental health of teenagers in American high school is a true disaster. So we need to publicize, to multiply awareness of how ordinary people think about equality. So when I did the interviews for The Dignity of Working Man, and I asked North African immigrants in Paris what makes people equal, they didn't talk about French republicanism. They talked about the fact that we all spend 9 months in our mother's womb, we all have 10 fingers, we're all children of God, we're all equally insignificant as cosmologically, or we're all children of God. So we need, I think, to spend much more time thinking about how ordinary people think about universalism, think about what makes people similar and different. What can politicians do? Well, I mentioned already the case of same-sex marriage. I think policymakers should systematically think about the stigmatizing effects of their policies. So when American policymakers adopted food stamps, where the poor had to stand in line and give their food stamps, of course, that was deemed to be a deeply stigmatized policies, and then they revised it, and people are now using a card that is far less conspicuous. But I think these questions should be looked at very systematically. Here in Budapest, many people are working on issues of collective memory and collective identity, and Michael will remember very well when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada, he proposed that Canada should be a multicultural country. This is what should define our collective identity, and I'm a French Canadian, so I remember very well how the Québécois, the French Québécois were pissed, because we thought of ourselves as one of two founding nations, and we were. But, you know, he was kind of putting us on the same footing as the Ukrainians of South Central Alberta or Saskatchewan, which was not a good thing in our view. But on the other hand, today when you survey Canadians about what distinguishes them from Americans, the main thing they talk about is multiculturalism. So the Canadian state has engaged in a transformation of collective identity project that has been extremely successful, and that has resulted in a much greater recognition for many immigrants. So I think we need to systematically think about collective memory and about engineering of collective identity with these things, issues of recognition in mind. And finally, what can citizens do? Well, after the Trump election, we got a lot of signs of this type on storefronts and in people's lawns. So clearly there's a strong concern about, you know, what kind of society people want to live in. You have rainbow flags everywhere in front of Unitarian Church. So the March for Women, there were posters of all kinds protesting Trump. So clearly I think many Americans are refusing the notion that we would live in a mean society. So we really, I think we cannot underestimate, and I know that in the context of what your own society is going through, and that some of you are working on questions of solidarity, I think it really is urgent for us to think very systematically about how, you know, recognition is produced not only from the cultural producers such as social scientists or journalists or others who contribute directly to the transformation of cultural repertoires, but also from the bottom up through everyday life to the kind of people I interviewed for getting respect. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much.